Hi, everybody. Hey. Thanks for all coming out here on a Saturday. I just want to do a few store announcements. Our next event is Monday, and it'll be at 6 o'clock. It is Faith Ringgold, and of course most of you remember her from Tar Beach and Aunt Connie's House, and her new book is called Invisible Princess. She will just be doing a signing. She will not be doing a reading. However, she did say that if anybody wanted to read the story for her, they could. So work on your reading voices this weekend, and we'll take volunteers on Monday. Thursday, February 11th at 6 o'clock, we have Jake Lamar. His last book was The Last Integrationist, and the new mystery is called Close to the Bone. And then on Friday, the 12th at 6 p.m., we've got Raymond Dobart. He is the co-author of Hidden in Plain View, which is all about decoding quilts and what their patterns and symbols actually mean. And today, we are very excited and very honored to have Faria Chiday with us, MTV correspondent, Newsweek editor, and now correspondent with ABC News. Her first book was Don't Believe the Hype, and now she talks to us about The Color of Our Future, which looks really at what this country will be like in the year 2050, that there will be no majority, what that is going to mean for us economically, socially, politically. So without further ado, please help me welcome Ms. Faria Chiday.
This is like one of my favorite bookstores in the whole world, and that's like a big world, so I'm very glad to be here. And I see a lot of you actually have the book, which is cool. I mean, I like that. I mean, it's not actually a prerequisite. I'm always willing to talk, even if people don't buy, but it's very nice. I came here for Don't Believe the Hype. When I wrote Don't Believe the Hype, I came to Vertigo, and we had a really great discussion. And so I want to kind of do the same thing today. You know, I'm going to talk, but I also want us to discuss these things. I want anyone who has questions to bring them up, because I'm, you know, on one of these grueling 3-week book tours, like a new city every day, like, okay, where am I? What's going on? You know, spent 2 days in D.C., which is like an eternity compared to the usual, like, 5 hours in each city. And I have gotten so many good questions, bad questions, crazy questions. There's no question that's off limits. So some of you are familiar with Don't Believe the Hype, which is my first book. And that book really took a statistical look at the myths and the realities about the black community. Because I've been a journalist ever since I graduated from college, and I love this profession. I joke that there's only 3 groups of people who have license to snoop in this country. It's clergy, you go to them, you tell them all your problems. Police officers, who have to carry a gun to snoop. And then there's journalists. We don't carry a gun, we don't have a clerical collar, and yet people confess everything to us. We'll ask them the most crazy, sometimes prying questions about their sex lives, their families, and they tell us. And I'm like, cool, you know. So I take that responsibility seriously, but the not so humorous side of it is when certain stereotypes about racial groups get replicated instead of debunked. And my business sometimes does that. A lot of times it's a interesting position I'm in, because I've been very lucky to move up the ranks of all these different news organizations, and yet at the same time I'm kind of the pain in the butt or the thorn in the side. I'm like, don't do that, don't do this, you know, are you really paying attention to what you're doing? I talk to my editors and argue with them about the nature of coverage of issues like drugs, welfare, crime, education, segregation. So that's my background. But like I said, I'm not the kind of person who's just about reading books. I'm about going out and meeting people, the idea of real face-to-face interaction. And so when I started to work on this book, the idea for the book and the concept and the execution, I really wanted to be in a position where I could meet a lot of different types of people in this society. I grew up, and the book has all of this, in Baltimore, right up the road, which is a very black and white city. You know, D.C. is too. But Baltimore, Maryland is a place where, you know, the neighborhood I grew up in was all Jewish. And then sometime before I arrived, through the miracle of white flight, it was all black. And so by the time I moved in as a 6-year-old kid, it was an all-black neighborhood. There were actually 2 white families on our block, which was like an exceptionally high number. And so first one left, and this is serious, I'm not kidding. The last white family to leave the block, they were blind. So it's like, you can draw whatever conclusions you want about that. But, so I grew up in an all-black neighborhood, and when I went to my school, my elementary school, which was right up the block, it's now no more, they tore it down, it was all black. And so I was growing up in a situation where my mother had grown up in Maryland, had gone to segregated schools, and they were all black. And I grew up in Maryland and went to an integrated school, which also happened to be all black. So we can see we still have a lot of issues to deal with. But then my mom got me into a magnet program, and she sent me to something called the Gifted and Talented program. And I went, and there was a much more multiracial atmosphere in my program at my new elementary school. There were black kids, white kids, Amerasian kids, a couple of Mexican-American brothers, and I had, you know, when I lived in New York, until I was 6. I was like, oh, okay, Puerto Ricans, blah, blah, blah. In Baltimore, at least where I grew up, there was like nobody who was Latino. And I'm sure that there was a community somewhere, but nowhere near where I lived. So I went from Baltimore, growing up in a very black and white city, to college, where one of my roommates freshman year was Chinese American. She's actually this woman who was on the show The Real World in San Francisco. She was the Chinese American doctor, you know. And then my other roommate, this was very funny. My other roommate freshman year was a white woman from Long Island, very, very sheltered. And she came a week late because she'd had appendicitis and had to have her appendix out. She came to school a week late. Everybody else is like chilling in the dorms. We've been there. We have our posters up. Her parents walk in, they nearly have a coronary because there's one black girl and one Chinese American girl. And they immediately march to the housing office like, get our daughter out of this. And to her great credit, this girl was like, no, you know, this is why I went to college, so I can see something different. So even though we had our misunderstandings over time, I really respect that because she didn't even get like a subliminal message. She just got a message, get out, you know, it's like, do not live with these people, you know. And so college opened up a whole bunch of issues for me because in college, you know, I had grown up in an all-black neighborhood in an all-black family. And when I got to college, some people were like, well, you're not black enough because you have friends who are not black. And I'm like, excuse me, Mr. Prep School, BMW driving, Jack and Jill going person. How come you telling me that I'm not black enough, you know? So I had my own beefs with how sometimes we can stereotype our own. So I learned a lot of things in college. First of all, my racial horizons were greatly expanded. I got to know not only people who were black and white, but also people who were immigrants from virtually every type of country, people who were Asian American and Latino. And I got to see some of the uncomfortable things that happen when, as inevitably happens, you take a whole bunch of people with completely different cultural reference points and you throw them together. And I'm a great believer that we can all get along if we choose to, but there's going to be some discussion, some fighting, some crying along the way. And the great mistake is to think that you can take somebody from a cornfield and somebody from the hood and somebody from an Indian reservation and put them all together and all of a sudden, you know, you have the Rainbow Coalition. It's just not like that. You know, you have to do some work. So I think that we shouldn't be afraid of doing that work. I mean, if you think about any of your friends that you're really close to, you probably have had a fight with them at some point. But you got over it because they're your friends, you know, and whatever differences you had, you transcended them. And I think that we need to look at race relations the same way. Very often, once something happens, we're like, okay, that's it. Those people can just be with themselves because I'm not talking to them anymore. And we have very little tolerance for moving beyond the inevitable disagreements. So this book is really about the future of race in America. And I decided to write it because I had this real sort of ongoing process of understanding race in this country, living in different cities with different racial dynamics, in different types of communities. Like right now I live in New York in this community, which is, it's basically like the young hip community. It's like Gap, Banana Republic, Urban Outfitters, Gap, Banana Republic, Urban. You know, it's like that's the common denominator. But there are people of all races, but not necessarily people of all classes. There's like, you know, a bunch of pretty pampered people. So I have seen a lot of different types of things. And I said to myself, you know what? If I have started questioning whether other people have the same reference points that I do, then I bet that a lot of other people in the society either are questioning whether their communities are reflective of this country, or worse yet, they're not questioning it. They're like, okay, what it's like in my town is what it's like. And it's understandable to say that, but it's also very wrong. No matter how we grew up, there are plenty of people in this country who grew up very differently, and that affects our inability to talk about race. I think that we really have an inability to discuss things on a constructive level because we all come to the table, we're like, well, that's the way it is. And that's just not the way it is, depending on where you're from. So this book I started out with this presumption that race in America was changing and that we all came from different perspectives on it. First, I did the statistical research and I looked into what was happening. First, there's a huge generational gap on race. People who are baby boomer age and older, as a group, are less than 20% Latino and non-white. People who are 15 to 25, as a group, are a third Black, Latino, Asian, and Native American. So there's this, America just looks different if you're young and if you're older. And that is just going to continue over time because in 50 years, for the first time ever, there will be more non-white Americans and Latino Americans than white Americans. And this whole concept we have of dividing people into majority and minority will no longer be valid. And I just have to say that that scares the hell out of a lot of people. They're like, oh my gosh, you know, the America as we know it is disappearing. This is a threat to our way of life. And if you look at some of the current debates over, you know, there is the group, the Council of Conservative Citizens, which some lawmakers on Capitol Hill have spoken to, and they call, you know, interracial mixing genocide by the bedroom chamber, and they talk about the massive brown glop, which is going to result from different people coming into the country. You know, they don't mince words about it. But a lot of other people have their fears and aren't necessarily going to say it. And so we do have this concept of America as a white nation without really discussing the fact that this country has never been just one race, just one people, or just one group contributing to it. So first of all, we have to think about the presumptions we have about American culture and society in relation to this change, because this is going to be a profound change. It's not going to happen like this, but it's happening now, and every few years we're going to see new benchmarks. Now, first of all, in 5 years, I noticed most people here are Black. I'm psyched about that. Like I say in the book, there's nothing wrong with the solidarity of your own community. I think that one thing that people mistake is that if you're talking about a multi-ethnic America, that you don't want to have a strong community of different types. Those two are not mutually exclusive. You can have a strong Black community and a strong Latino community, but you should have dialogue between them and not fighting. So in 5 years, there's going to be more Latinos than Blacks. And one thing that I've noticed is that Black people are not happy about that. We are freaking out. We're like, you know, it's like, because like even being like the second largest group, we're just like, that's our place, you know. And I think that what's really interesting is that every group in America, which is non-white, experiences discrimination, but every group experiences it differently. So when you look at Black Americans, we are the most segregated. We get the least pay for having the same educational qualifications and job qualifications as other people, and so on. When you look at Latino Americans, they actually have a higher poverty rate than Black Americans because a lot of the community is new immigrants and are not earning a lot of money at first, but hopefully they'll move up the ladder. When you look at Asian Americans, they have the highest rate of education, highest rate of college graduation, but they also make less than white Americans. And so even through their high achievement, they aren't able to reach parity with white Americans. So I think that we all experience things differently. But one thing that really sets Black people apart from other non-white groups is that people see us. Sometimes they see us and fear us, but they see us. And with other groups, you don't see them. When you look at television, when you look at primetime television, 18% of the television characters are Black, as compared to 13% of the country. When you look at Latinos on television, literally 1% of television characters are Latino compared to 11% of the country. Proportionately, there are fewer Latinos on television today than there were in the 1950s. And so one of the weird dynamics about race is that some people are seen and some people are not seen. And we have this, I think that profound discrepancy reflects the fact that our mindset is not catching up to the changes in this country. We are sort of living mentally in the past. We have this image of America which hasn't changed while this country is changing. And so that said, that's sort of the framework for this book. And now I get to the fun part, which is basically talking about the stories. I decided if I was going to do a book like this on the future of race, people would say, oh, Farai, what's your book on? I would say, it's on the future of race in America. They'd be like, that's a nice small topic. You know, it's like, you can't just talk about the future of race in America. You have to break it down. So I did two things. First of all, I decided to talk about young people, people age 15 to 25, people who were old enough to understand something about the dynamics of this country, but also young enough to still be making their minds up, and people who did symbolize this change in race in America. And then I also decided to do one issue in one community in each chapter, so that I could really spend some time with folks, get to know them, know their parents, know their neighborhoods. And, you know, in the first two chapters, there's a couple of people who really symbolize the best and worst that I saw. First guy is the best, you know. He really, and if some of you were watching some of the TV appearances I've done here, you already know this, so be quiet. But there's this guy named Earl. His name's Earl Carr. He goes to the College of William and Mary. He grew up in New York City. Now, his father is Jamaican, and his mother is Chinese Panamanian. His mother's parents immigrated from the Fujian province of China to Panama, where they raised a little girl who looked Chinese but spoke Spanish. Then she went to New York, married a black man, got disinherited by her parents. They were like, oh, you know, and had 4 kids, and one of them is Earl. And so Earl basically looks, like I say in the book, like a Chinese guy with a tan and wavy hair. That just happens to be how he turned out. So he doesn't really look black, and he looks more Asian than black, but he doesn't really look just Asian either. So Earl has been rejected by almost everybody, but also embraced by almost everybody. He's gotten stuff from blacks, he's gotten stuff from Asians, but when he went to the College of William and Mary, most colleges have all sorts of divides. So he went there and he was like, okay, I am going to join, and he belongs to the Caribbean Students Association, the Black Students Association, the Gospel Choir, and the Chinese Students Association. And he's like, I'm gonna bring my Chinese homies to the gospel sing-along, you know? And he's totally like, you know, he's just like, this is who I am, and you're gonna come with me on my journey through myself, you know? And that attitude is really beautiful because, you know, he knows he has all these different sides, and he's bringing people along with him. And he's trying to cross-pollinate groups of people who probably normally wouldn't get to know each other. So that, to me, is a great reaction to his own heritage and to the changes this country's going through. The worst thing that I saw was in Thomasville, Georgia, which is close to Tallahassee, Florida. There was a case some of you might have heard about 3 years ago where an interracial couple had a baby. The baby died because of a birth defect. It was an unavoidable thing. So the baby was buried in the white woman's family's church cemetery. So this church is an all-white Southern Baptist church, and 3 of the 6 deacons at the church said, the baby is a half-breed, it's not white, this is a cemetery for white people, so dig the baby up. And this provoked a huge outrage, as it should have. And the person leading the fight to kind of deal with this outrage was the grandmother of the dead child, so the mother of the woman, the white woman who bore the child. Now this woman, this to me is an interesting lesson all in itself. Here you've got a white woman in her 50s who is crusading against the racism of a church that her family belongs to. But until this incident, she and her husband flew a Confederate flag above their home. When I drove up to visit them and talk with them, their neighbors still had a Confederate flag, and when I drove and when I got out of my car, they were not too happy to see a black person in their neighborhood. And so they were people who couldn't stand the fact that their daughter was dating a black man. But once their family was disrespected, the race issue became very personal to them. So that was one layer of it. The second layer of it was, to me, much more disturbing. You know, I generally have a lot of fun as a reporter. I had a lot of fun working on this book, but some parts are not really that fun. And one of the parts that was not that fun was that I went to this all-white church. Which had threatened to dig up this baby. So first I call down, you know, from New York, and I try to speak to the pastor. They hang up on me. Then I'm like, okay, well, how much of a wimp am I gonna be? I gotta go to this church. So I drive up long before services start. I'm like sitting in my car like this. I'm like, and then as people go in, you know, services are about to start, I run in, sit in the back row, sit through services, which are perfectly nice. A few people ask me who I am. I just give them my name. Needless to say, not a parishioner, you know, only black person in there. And then after services, I'm talking to the parishioners outside. I talk to the pastor. He gives me a whole bunch of BS, frankly, about why this isn't a racial incident. But overall, I was really impressed by how nice these parishioners were. And they were honestly nice. I mean, you know, I got a pretty good detector for when people are faking and when people are nice. And I think that the people who I spoke with, were nice. Now, why did that make me sad and not happy? Because what it said to me was that these people knew that their church had perpetrated this incident. And yet they said to themselves, I'm going to keep going to this church. I'm in this small town. I don't want to rock the boat. I'm not going to leave the church. I'm not going to ask that the people who did this be removed from the church. And so their attitude, even though they were nice people, was like, not my problem. And that to me is kind of the essence of race in America today. There's always going to be the people who do the horrible things, and there's always going to be the people crusading to do the right thing. And most of us are somewhere in the middle. And the people in the middle determine everything. If the people in this church had said, this is an outrage, you deacons, get out of our church, pastor, how come you didn't stop this? Then the whole dynamic would be very different. But they stood silent while the deacons who had perpetrated this tried to pretend that this was not an outrage. So that was something that I found very interesting. And it's also, it's just an example of how ridiculous, you know, and how what I call ground zero racism still permeates our society. You know, I mean, we would like to think that we have moved to the next level. And sometimes we have, and sometimes we haven't. You know, sometimes the things that are really old school still happen. And I also spoke with a young woman who was in the white supremacist movement, who came from a very wealthy family and decided, I mean, her family sounds, you know, fairly dysfunctional, but nothing out of the ordinary. You know, so she didn't get a lot of attention from her father or from her mother, and she decided that she needed a new family, and her new family was the skinhead movement. Even though she had all these advantages and she'd gone to art school and she had, you know, the silver spoon in her mouth, she decided that she needed a new group of people to identify with, and her way of doing that was to join the skinhead movement, and she in fact became the first woman to lead a skinhead faction. So she was breaking the gender barrier, but on the race side, it was not too cool. And so, I mean, I could see, and I always try, even if I completely disagree with somebody's standpoint, I always try to understand where they're coming from. And so when I looked at this woman, this white supremacist skinhead, you know, it seemed to me very clear she was looking for two things. The first of all was a group to belong to, which she found. And the second was a way to make her society better. She honestly believed, and of course I don't believe with her, but she honestly believed that the way to make America better was at the very least to keep blacks and whites totally separate, and better yet, send the blacks back to Africa and have whites take over America again. And that's the way to make America better. So she was trying to do that. And I think that whenever we think about race and whenever we think about the issues that are just absolutely devastating, we have to remember that the things that people do out of hatred seem logical to them, and that we don't have to respect that, but it helps us to understand what they're thinking. So that obviously I didn't try to change her mind. I can't change her mind. I couldn't change her mind. But someone who feels a little bit like the way that she does, if you understand how she thinks, you may be able to convince the person that's further this way that what they're thinking is wrong. But if you don't understand why she thinks what she thinks, you can't ever have a discussion with a person who suspects or wonders or maybe thinks a little bit the way that she does. So those were the extremes of good and bad. But then I also traveled to places basically where there was nothing much going on, and saw how people were just leading their lives. And this is something, you know, I see pop culture. Pop culture is something that I'm totally into. I did the first interview with the Fugees before, way before their first album came out. I went to Lauryn Hill's dorm room and hung out with her, and her roommate was sleeping under the covers in their bunk bed. And, you know, I just love pop culture and hip hop in particular. So in the course of doing this book, I went to an Indian reservation in Montana, and they were listening to hip hop. I went to an all-white town in the Midwest, and they were listening to hip hop. I went to South Central, and of course, they were listening to hip hop. You know, everywhere I went, Asian kids, black kids, white kids, Latino kids were all listening to hip hop. And so I think that we've reached this really weird place in our culture where, despite the fact that we have all these continuing problems, we also have this weird kind of identification of youth culture as black culture. And people all over are, you know, it's like the lingo, the dress, it's just they're trying, I mean, this is just my neighborhood. My neighborhood has a lot of young Japanese immigrants. For some reason, it's become like, you know, this hip place for young Japanese immigrants to move. So there's great sake bars, great sushi, whatever. I can't tell you how many kids have dreadlocks or afros. And if you thought about what it takes to make dead straight hair get into an afro, I mean, like, they must have put more curler rods in her hair than there are stars in the sky. But let me tell you, homegirl has, like, she has a light brown, caramel brown afro. And I know that that is not what she was born with, you know? And so everybody wants to be down with the image of blackness, but it's still a far cry from being down with the reality. And I had a chance to talk to, you know, Puff Daddy, Sean Puffy Combs, you know, one of the most rich and famous guys in the whole hip-hop array, you know, somebody who's idolized by some and hated by others and whatever. But, you know, fact of the matter is he has made the marketing of rap music an art. You know, he can wring every dollar out of the pockets of young Americans, you know, and you know, when I had talked to them, he'd just gotten a $40 million bonus. That is 40,000,000.00. And so, you know, he's wearing more diamonds and all this stuff. And so I talked to him, and, you know, we're talking about whether or not he thinks hip-hop, the fact that hip-hop is being consumed by people of all races, does that mean that there's a new enlightenment? And he's like, well, you know, just because people love Puff or because they love Mace or because they love Tupac does not mean that they love black people. And I realize that. And I think that that's very true. What I do want to say is that I think that culture is a window. Culture is a sometimes flawed window. And then you have to open the door and walk through it to get any enlightenment. You know, kids who buy a CD are buying a snapshot of one part of the black community. And that may or may not translate into enlightenment. It could. You know, some kids, honestly, that's a starting point. And they start reading, they start learning, they start talking to other people. And for some kids, it's just a way to annoy their parents. Because frankly, I have this kid upstairs from me. You know, he's, you know, like I said, I live in the East Village. It's very hip and young and whatever. And this 15-year-old kid lives above me. He happens to be white, but he could be of any race. 3:30 in the morning, he's got his hip-hop blasting through my bedroom ceiling. And so I'm always talking to his parents about it. And you know what? I'm sure I'm just like a byproduct of this whole conflict. But I think he does it to drive his parents crazy. And for some people, hip-hop is just a way to drive their parents crazy. They're like, okay, heavy metal is played out. My mom got used to that, so now I'm going to go to hip-hop. It's like, you know, escalating to the bigger gun, you know? It's like, so we have to realize that people do consume this culture for different reasons. And I also worry, as a fan of hip-hop, if the image that people are getting from hip-hop is one that we necessarily want to be putting out. And as someone who writes for Vibe magazine, I talked about how hip-hop is permeated like every country. It's not just every color. I went to Paris and people were playing Cypress Hill. I went, you know, to Johannesburg, South Africa. I went to Zimbabwe. I went, like, everywhere I go. I haven't been to Russia, but I bet they probably have hip hop too. You know, and it's our hip hop. I mean, usually some people have their own, but also they're consuming our version of youth culture. And so I think we have a responsibility to realize that these messages are reaching a wide audience, and we have a responsibility to make sure that those messages are accurately portraying our community and letting people know what we want them to hear. You know, it's not just about amusing ourselves, it's also about how do we project ourselves to the world. So that was one commonality I saw, this emphasis on a multiracial youth culture. Another thing that I saw, which is I don't want to say more important, but which is certainly more critical in the long term for kids, is the disparities in education. You know, basically, if you ended racism today and everybody moved forward from here, you would still, at least for a time, have these very profound discrepancies because of the inequalities that have existed so far and the inequalities of opportunity which persist today. And nowhere did I see it more than in the school system. I went, you know, because I was talking about 15 to 25-year-olds, I spent a lot of time in schools. And so there is no question that the race gap is just totally persisting in schools. And I think that for me, I spent a month in the Bay Area and spent a lot of time at two places, a high school in Oakland, California, and Berkeley, where affirmative action was being dismantled as we spoke, you know. And And one thing that I was, because I think that one question that this change in America begs is, okay, fine, America's becoming more multiracial. Does that mean we're becoming more enlightened or more divided? Does that mean that the society will look at blacks as the outsider and everyone else will assimilate into white culture, or that whites will remain the insiders and everybody else will be considered inferior? And what I saw in California was pretty disturbing to me, in the sense that increasingly I saw, and not necessarily were all people in all groups going along with this, but politically people were trying to draw a line down the middle and say, whites and Asians are on this side of the line, blacks and Latinos are on this side of the line. When people were talking about affirmative action, it was like the blacks and Mexicans who are not qualified to enter this school, and the Asians and whites who are losing out. And so I think that we have to be very careful as time goes by not to replicate the same color line that we have and just split everybody else who's coming into this country up on different sides. I think that's very possible and very destructive. And when I went to Berkeley, I met two people who, again, sort of epitomized the best and the worst for me. There was this guy, Steve. Steve just, this was the weirdest interview I've ever done, because a lot of times I'm like trying to be crafty. I'm like, okay, I'm going to ask the perfect question, and I'm going to get behind their defenses, and they're going to tell me everything that they didn't want to tell me. Steve was just like, he was an open book. I walked in, he was the head of the Berkeley College Republicans, and I had just interviewed the heads of all these different student groups, Asian student groups, student government, blah, blah, blah. So, we're sitting in an outdoor cafe. It's a beautiful day. I have my tape recorder. I have my notepad. And we start talking about life at Berkeley. He's like, I'm a racist. My family's racist. That's the way we are. I recruit in fraternities where minorities are not welcome. Those blacks and Mexicans are poor, so they live in the ugly dorms. And, the kids from Hong Kong live in the best dorm because they've got their cell phones and their Beamers, and and then the whites live in, and he was just like, and so the thing that tripped me out the most, he just basically spewed off for like half an hour. The thing was that he's not white. He's an immigrant from Iran. Actually, he was a refugee as a kid. And when he first moved to town, people were calling his family camel jockeys and terrorists and murderers. And so he's seen the ugly side of race in America, and he's felt it himself. Anti-Arab or anti-Middle Eastern racism. And yet, his strategy was like, okay, this is the deal. People call me a camel jockey, so I'll call them a nigger. And so, therefore, that was like his strategy, like deflect attention, move it on to someone else. And it was just pretty phenomenal to me how blatant he was about it. And so that was sort of one side of, what I saw. And he was the kind of, he popped a cork when the regents voted down affirmative action, popped a cork of champagne and sat around with his friends, discussing how much better this would be. And of course, at Berkeley now, the number of blacks and Latinos admitted to the freshman class each year has dropped by half since affirmative action was outlawed. The new governor of California, Gray Davis, is trying some ways of remedying that. But what I see in California is basically, California is both the best and worst case scenario for America. California right now is about 40% Latino, Black, Asian, and Native American. California will be the first mainland state in America to cross that barrier, where there's no one racial majority. And unfortunately, many white Californians are losing it. They are freaking out. And so a lot of the legislative power and a lot of the economic power is being expended on trying to contain and minimize the impact of the non-white population. And so what do you have? You have a state where, like every other state in America, blacks and Latinos tend not to get as good of an education as whites. And then you have a college system, a very prestigious state university system that produces the next generations of leaders for the state of California. So once you cut the black and Mexican students out of the loop of getting those quality educations, the people who are qualified to fill the leadership positions economically and politically in the state remain much whiter than the state as a whole. So I think we have to realize that what we're doing, and in many cases for some people unintentionally, not for Ward Connolly, but for many other people unintentionally, is creating this permanent barrier to any kind of progress, any kind of power sharing in the state of California, and I think that could be replicated across the country. And I think of a woman who I interviewed for this book named LaShunda. And LaShunda is written into the Berkeley chapter, And she really impressed me as this really wonderful, strong woman. She went to one of the worst schools in Oakland, and that's saying a lot. It's like saying, it's like saying the hottest part of hell. You know what I mean? It's like, so she went to one of the worst schools in Oakland, and she did everything right. She graduated as the valedictorian. She was working her butt off, and she got to Berkeley totally unprepared because her school had never taught her the things that she needed to know. Not only that, she played really hard and she caught up. She fell behind, she caught up. But like all the white students were like, ugh, you're black. Like, I'm going to be your lab partner? I don't think so. And so she was constantly like, please be my lab partner. She was an engineering major. She had a really hard time convincing people because, she's very smart and she ended up, like I said, graduating. But, she's from the hood. She's not like, like bougie black women, and she can't wear little suits like this and stuff. She was like straight up from the hood. And everybody saw her and was just like, like she shouldn't even set foot on campus without there being security, And so she had to fight her way through every step of the way. And that is what the tragedy is of these inequalities in education. When you have people who are eminently intelligent and motivated and are not educated to take a leadership role in society, people who could be leaders, people who could be sharing power and creating coalitions, but who are not put in a position where they are equipped to do so. So I think that's something that has to be looked at. And I went to another school, a school that sends some kids to Berkeley, and it's in Oakland, and it's also kind of a school. But there's one program that's really great, and it's this media academy. And of course I was like, cool, kids in media, and I got to know them through that. And the reason that they're so successful, they're successful on two levels. First of all, they're successful at getting kids of different races to work together, because the school is like a third black, a third Asian, a third Latino. White people are in a little asterisk in the whole equation, because Oakland is not only majority minority, but also segregated. So the school is a third, a third, a third, but it's not necessarily mixed. Just saying that there are people there doesn't mean that they're mixed among themselves. So this program takes the kids on an outward bound program, so they get to know each other. They break down this black girl was like, I thought all the Asian girls were nerds and they didn't have any problems and everything was perfect, and all the stereotypes come up and are dealt with. And then on an academic level, they're focused. They're like, we have a deadline every month to put out a magazine. We have a deadline every week to put out a television show, and they do some really phenomenal stuff. And so through just a little bit more work, a little bit more attention, they're able to get these kids to a place where they can really achieve. But then also, speaking of racial dynamics, one of the most interesting characters I found at that school was this kid named Justin. And Justin he sent me an email, because I did part of my interview by email and part of it over the phone and part of it in person. He's like, hey, this is Justin, the only white kid. And that's what he's been his whole life. He lives in a neighborhood where he's the only white kid. He went all through school, he was the only white kid. And in his program, he was the only white kid. And he's got blonde hair and blue eyes, and his parents, who are white, just never moved out of their neighborhood as the whole neighborhood changed from white to non-white. And so he dated two girls in high school. One was Latina and one was Laotian. And of course, the Laotian parents were not having it. They were like, so he learned to speak some Laotian. He was like, I'm worthy of dating your daughter. And they were still like, but they, now they get along. And he basically, what was most interesting to me about him was that he says, you know what, and this is towards the end of a long conversation, I'm not really that comfortable around white people because I just haven't spent that much time with them. And, whenever I'm in a place where I'm around a lot of white people, I just don't feel that comfortable. And what that says to me is that a lot of the problems that we have with race, the problems we have with talking to each other, are not because of skin color, they're because of acculturation. How we grow up and who we grow up around has a lot to do with who we're comfortable with. So this guy, even though he's clearly white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, all that stuff, his acculturation is, I'm living in a neighborhood with all people of color, and that's who my friends are, and that's my community. And so he feels this weird sense of unease. And not that he should, but he does. And so I think that we need to remember, that it is perfectly normal for us to feel this discomfort when we cross these racial lines. But that shouldn't prevent us from doing it. It shouldn't prevent us from getting over it and discussing it. And it's going to take work. I mean, I have a million different stories in this book. I have stories about going out with the Border Patrol and talking to kids who were immigrants without papers and all that stuff. But I think I'm going to stop and get ready to get some questions from you guys. But I guess what I would say is that to me, this book, obviously this book is two things. One, it's a book of stories. It's a book of stories about all these people who I met, and simply through looking at their lives, you get to see just how different our experience of race in America is. This is a vast country with vastly different communities, and we can't all expect to be on the same page. You know, if to talk to a kid in a 99% white town about the segregation of a city like Chicago, they have no idea what you're talking about. And so you shouldn't presume. You shouldn't presume that they're stupid. You should just know that they have no reference point whatsoever for understanding what you're talking about. And so, especially looking at the example of California, where basically, as the country has, I mean, as the state has become more non-white, you have gotten all of these fights. You have gotten the battle to ban affirmative action, the battle to stop immigration, the battle, you know, everything that could come up has come up. And very often, what happened was very reactionary, and I think very short-sighted, and I think will hurt the state in the long run by creating a black-brown permanent underclass. I just want to say that this is in our hands, and that as California has gone, we could go, or not. So whatever happens in our communities is up to us. Depends on how we vote, how we treat people, depends on how we change or don't change the schools in our communities. And I really think that what we have to do is focus on the grassroots, because race is very personal and race is very local. And for example, thinking about the African American community in particular, I think we have a lot of work to do because we are no longer going to be the dominant minority. And when I think about a place like South Central LA, South Central used to be mostly black. Believe it or not, it is mostly Latino. So even the neighborhoods we think of as black neighborhoods are no longer necessarily that. And so I think that every black church should be reaching out to a Latino church and forming some kind of coalition and beginning some kind of discussion of common issues and problems and of differences. And I think that the reality of the matter is that the people who are more powerful in this society will always have the easiest time dealing with whatever problems come up. Because worst comes to worst, move to a gated community on a hill, hire a couple of guards with, you know, rifle sights, you know. But everybody else is going to have to figure it out, you know, on the real. And so the black community has, in some ways, the greatest stake in this. And we have to figure out, we're going to have to do a lot of the hard work in figuring out how this country changes. And I think that the first thing that black communities need to do is work on a grassroots level within schools, churches, you know, community groups, and try to figure out, first of all, who's in your neighborhood. If you live in a black neighborhood, it probably is no longer just black. It probably has some immigrants, probably has some Latinos. Maybe it's heavily immigrant or Latino. Maybe there's Asian Americans. Figure out who lives in your neighborhood. Figure out where they go to church. Figure out where they send their kids to school. Try to understand a little bit more about how your community is changing and deal with it on a personal level. And deal with your own baggage. I know I have baggage. I mean, you know, you can't grow up in this country without it. And so educate yourself and educate others. Thank you. So I will take whatever questions anybody has. Okay. Hey, how's it going?
All right. How's the work atmosphere at ABC News, speaking of along racial lines?
No comment. No, just kidding. No. I've generally had a good time at ABC, but I don't think there's a perfect company for the media. You know, I've also accepted kind of, I have this really weird role and a very privileged role as this little inside agitator. You know, there's people who are like, why don't you quit your job and just be an activist? I'm like, that's a possibility. Other people are like, why don't you run for president? I'm like, And then, you know, there's all these different, you know, we could all make these different choices. I choose to be someone who is kind of this insider, but I certainly, you know, I'm always saying we should do this, we should do that. And also because working at ABC, there's like a million different divisions. Sometimes I suggest something, people are like, cool, 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 cool. Other times I suggest it to someone else, they're like, uh-uh. And I think that the reality of the matter is, if you're black and in the media, you're always going to have to fight harder to justify your ideas. And I think that's, you know, one reason why I'm such like a little argumentative person. And because the presumption is always that I'm going to have to defend why I want to do something and how I want to do something. And as long as you get used to that, as long as you can become persuasive and certainly persistent enough. How about doing the story? No. Come on, why don't we do the story? No. Please? No. Come on? No. Okay, finally I wear them down. So I accept that. And, you know, and for the most part I enjoy what I do, but it certainly requires a little bit more elbow grease to get some stories done.
Have you ever interviewed the African American gentleman who led the fight against affirmative action in California? And if so, where do you think his whole psyche is? Like, what? And if not, what do you? I mean,
Right.
I can't understand him. So,
Well, you know, I mean, personally, you know, I doubt he would talk to me because I talk trash about him all the time. But as an editor at Vibe, a contributing editor at Vibe, I had someone else interview him, another black reporter, a woman who works for Time. And boy, I include some of his quotes in my book from this interview with Vibe. Because the thing that came out that's just the most stunning to me, and I go into this in great depth, is that the same people who are like, preference is bad, preference for race is bad, all of them were pulling strings to get their friends' kids into schools. So Ward Connerly was pulling strings to try to get kids in. Governor Pete Wilson was pulling strings. So it's like, preference is bad for you. It's good for me. And it's just like, so, I mean, you know, you can read all about it, but it's just like, Chris Rock had a great line. You know, Chris Rock has this show on HBO. He had Ward Connerly on, and Ward was, you know, giving out his, and he said, but wait, let me just get this straight. You're a black man who makes a living defending the rights of the white man. And it was just like, I mean, you know, that's just him. That's Ward. So he's, you know, I'm glad, you know, it's just funny. He's, I think that his political views are very clear. Why he has them are another question entirely for him and his shrink to resolve.
Notice you're talking about your experience on a white college campus or whatever. I've noticed the paucity of blacks in certain Ivy Leagues and whatnot. How does the black student, how does he get through school? And how do the black students, how do they interact with the other races? Because they're going to this campus where everybody is mostly white. So they have like black student union, black this, black that. When they go to these campuses, do they have to balkanize themselves from the white students to get through? Because most of them either quit or they get through. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because of their color.
You know, to me it was interesting because, like I said, I grew up in an all-black neighborhood, so I was like, okay, I'm in college, now I can have friends of other races because now I'm in this multiracial environment. And I was criticized by black students for doing that. But I do think that black organizations are critical for black students. I mean, somebody was saying, well, why do black people need black this and black that? It's like, because everything else is de facto majority white. And as, you know, this guy Steve was saying at Berkeley, some things are not just majority white, they're just white. You know, some fraternities, no matter what they say in their charter, you just can't join. And some groups you can join, but you won't feel welcome. So I do think that black organizations on majority white campuses are very important, but I also think it's important for black students to realize that this should be part of your college experience and not the whole thing. You know, I mean, I think that the reason for black support groups on campuses should be to give you a home base. But do you not leave your house? I mean, likewise, you should have a home base, but be able to go outside it and make friends of other races. So it's a very delicate balancing act. I mean, I do strongly believe that there's a need, you know, and certainly at Harvard there was a need. There were all sorts of incidents that came up, you know, racial incidents by police officers. And, you know, at the time that I was there, the Black Studies Department was in the toilet, and now it's obviously really strong. But I also want to caution that while we need very strong black organizations on campus, that we also need to, you know, do the coalition building that we do in neighborhoods. But we also, I mean, if we're going to have black organizations on campus, let's make them about the business of getting more people educated. That should be the #1 priority, getting the people who are in college through and getting more people of color in. A lot of organizations are just like, yeah, man, this isn't fair. It's like, that's not sufficient. You know, set up a meeting with the dean, look at the statistics that the school puts out on recruiting, find out where they're recruiting, try to recruit some more people from the high school you went to. It's not sufficient. Like when I was there, I called up the kids who were admitted from my high school and from Baltimore, and I tried to get them to come. Of course, none of them came, but, you know, at least I tried, you know, and so anyone who's in school should be thinking about, you know, bringing the next group along. Anybody else? Okay.
I want to ask you this question. Singapore has been described as the multicultural wonder of the world. And so, you know, probably the United States is moving to that kind of society in the year 2050, I think you cite. So, but then Singapore too has problems. There are problems of economics and, you know, haves and the have-nots and so on. So what I'm saying is that I hear your thesis, but at the same time, you're going to have all these different minorities and so on. We're all going to, it's going to be probably a whole society of minorities. But what I want to suggest is that if probably President Clinton, if anything good could have come out of his race commission, the President's Commission on Race, I think it would have been something like, you know, because there's always going to be this racial divide. The people are always going to have prejudices and so on. But something that could help it, I think, like maybe if he gets universal health care through something like that, you know, maybe next go on to something like housing or maybe free food. I don't know what. I mean, but, you know, these things, he's done a lot
So things that are more concrete.
Yeah, things like that.
Yeah, no, I support the race initiative in the sense that, you know, yeah, it's good to talk about it. But I do think that we have to remedy sort of the underlying economic inequalities, and then a lot of the work of unity has to be done on a grassroots level. I mean, I really believe that we have to look to our communities, and your community can be your college, your high school, your neighborhood, whatever, a group of people online, whatever communities that you feel that you're a part of, you should be thinking about this and thinking about how it affects it. But I agree with you that, you know, that the concrete work has to be done. And I also just, I mean, you know, I want to make it clear that these changes could come painfully or they could be positive. I mean, you know, it's sort of like revolution or evolution. Something is going to happen, and what happens really depends on the work that we do in the next 50 years.
You visited reservations.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the issues that young Native Americans had and their roles in the future?
Yeah. For me, you know, there were a few places I visited that were really just different for me, in the sense that when I went to the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, that was a part of America that I had never experienced, and there were all sorts of dynamics between Mexicans and Mexican Americans and so on that I hadn't seen or understood before. Likewise, when I went to this reservation, which was the Crow Indian Reservation in Montana and Wyoming, it was very new for me. And we Black Americans often think of ourselves as like, oh, we have suffered the most, blah, blah, blah. And largely, that's very true. But man, wait till you go to a reservation. You have not seen. I mean, basically, you take the same issues that affect the most segregated, isolated, and impoverished Black Americans in the inner city, and you take all the people and you scatter them over a few thousand acres of land. In this case, there's 7,000 Indians, enrolled tribal members, living on 2.5 million acres of land. And so you kind of have a choice. You can either give up your community, give up your ranch, or give up whatever, and move to a big majority white city and not see your friends, not see your family, not have your culture around you, and have a job. Or you can live where your land is and where your people are and be on welfare. I mean, that is how serious it is. I mean, there's no jobs. For like 100 miles, there's no jobs, you know? And it's a very painful predicament. And the reason I went to this reservation is because they have a great tribal college. And there's a whole system of institutions called tribal colleges, which are set up by and for Native Americans. And so this tribal college teaches Crow history and culture and language and all this stuff, and also it has one of the best computer science labs in the state, and it has a great environmental sciences program because a lot of people can work for fish and wildlife. And it's trying to, I mean, it's definitely educating tribe members, but the persistent question is, what kind of jobs? I mean, what kind of industry? I mean, you still have, like, now you have, people can stay on the reservation to get an education, but after that, when they want to work, it's very difficult to stay there. The only things to do are basically to be an administrator of the social services to other people in the tribe. And I don't know what the solution is, but I think it's very painful because the more scattered tribe members become, the less likely people are to speak the language, and they're going to lose their culture. So, and I think it's very interesting. They also sort of adopted, even though they are anything but urban, they sort of adopted this urban people of color mentality. They were all wearing Georgetown jackets. They all played basketball, and they were all listening to Master P. So that just goes to show. This was very interesting to me.
You spoke a lot about the 15 to 25 age range, and I was just wondering, in talking to the different students and people around the country, what your insight was on whether they had a lack of activism. Meaning, did you find a lot of young people that were into issues, and what were they do? Were they doing grassroots stuff? Because I know, as someone that falls in that age group, I have a hard time finding people in my age group that are like willing to get out there with me and like hit the pavement and do all these things. Like they'll speak about it, or they'll know that it's on the news, but it's like
no, it's true. The question was about activism. Is this an activist generation or an apathetic generation, I guess? When I went to Berkeley, and it was the affirmative action issue, the kids who are the activists, because they organized massive rallies, were like, you know what? We organize this rally with the same 100 people that always help organize the rally. And you know what? If the students at the UC schools, first of all of the presidents of the UC schools supported continuing affirmative action. And then, of course, a lot of the students, I would wager most of the students did. If that energy was somehow channeled properly, things would be very different. But there was sort of this, what you're talking about, oh, this is terrible, sad, yeah. And we have to do better than that. I mean, and this is another reason, this is taking me off on another tangent, but it's like, and this is truly a tangent, but anytime African Americans whine about some group that moves into our communities and, they're taking all of this, it's like, look, man, I know that the Pakistani family that works down the street from me, who runs the corner store, they work 15 hours a day. So I don't want to hear it, so there are times when, we have a lot of legitimate gripes, but sometimes we don't legitimately do what we need to do to end the gripes. And we have to do better. We have to use our power, because I think that we have a lot of power, and especially at Berkeley, where there were so many students of color who felt strongly. All the university presidents in the UC system felt the same way. They all felt that affirmative action should be maintained. There was no excuse for the debate to be so one-sided, but I just think that the energies weren't properly channeled, and anyone who cares about these issues has to really encourage other people to join in.
The women's studies department, women's studies programs in colleges, like what you thought of them as far as including ethnic women of color and different things like that, and then talking about diversity, different things like that. Because I know in my women's studies program, my senior year, that was one of the big things, and they were trying to get more instructors and trying to get more classes that talked about women of color, because even though we would talk about it, it would kind of be like we would just talk of it. And we really wouldn't get into the nitty-gritty. And I was just wondering where you saw that going and what you thought of women's studies programs.
Right. The question was about women's studies programs and how they're incorporating race as well as other issues. And I do think, first of all, I'm very supportive of women's studies programs the same way I am of black studies and other ethnic studies. I think that interdisciplinary majors always have challenges to overcome. You don't just want to be like, oh, anytime a black person was within 500 feet of this, then, this can be black studies. We have to do a lot of work of defining, what we want to study. But I think that you can't study gender without studying race, because first of all, the civil rights movement precipitated the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, a lot of subsequent movements. But also, I have met a lot of professors who are trying to deal with the issues of race, because feminism means very different things to black women and white women. And unfortunately, and I'm sometimes guilty of this myself, black women are just like, I don't want to deal with their feminist stuff because that stuff is whack. It's all like them sitting around eating bonbons talking about women's stuff, where I just deal with my stuff. It's like we have this attitude of like, we always have had to take care of ourselves, therefore I don't want to hear any whininess about, whatever, And so I think that the same way that there has to be a racial dialogue in general, there has to be a dialogue between black and white women and women of all races. And I also think that what's interesting is that when I talk about the persistent inequalities that race has inspired, that gender totally different for different racial groups. When you look at Black Americans, Black women earn what white women earn. Black men earn nowhere near what white men earn. But of course, men earn more than women, so I mean, there's so many complex dynamics, but the dynamics of gender in the Black community are very different from the dynamics of gender in the white community. And as we, I mean, one thing that's true is that on most majority white college campuses and on many majority Black college campuses, you can't find a Black man. It's like, there's like, there's like so-and-so and so-and-so, all these women, and it's like 5 Black men on campus. Like a friend of mine went to Swarthmore, and it was like, yeah, there's our 5 Black men, and it's like we switch around. Like one of them gets to date one of them every semester, and it's like, so it's so we don't want to move into the future where the racial discrepancies also have these huge ramifications in gender as well. Okay.
I didn't read your book, so you might have
That's
mentioned
okay.
this in your chapter. Did you mention anything about abortion? And the reason I say that is abortion demonstrations tend to be in this area, let's say in Falls Church and Spring or Silver Spring, not in Anacostia. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Exactly.
And to me, my personal opinion, I think that the abortion issue with a lot of groups tend to be there's a certain type of baby that is being aborted that we're concerned about. And,
well, a lot of people talk about this. The question was about abortion and race, and most abortion protestors tend to be white, even though a lot of Black Americans are very much against abortion. Basically, if you read white supremacist literature, they're like, we are being outbred. I mean, there's like no question in the minds of white supremacists what the issue is. It's like those people are reproducing faster than us, therefore they're going to overtake us, therefore we either have to move to the hills of Montana or, we have to outbreed them. And I think that that's not the whole abortion debate by any means, but sometimes that undercurrent does run through things. And I have seen that. So it's a interesting, there's so many, like this whole idea of genocide via the bedroom chamber. In this literature from this group, the Council of Conservative Citizens, they said, genocide via the bedroom chamber is just as bad as genocide via the gas chamber. It was this whole idea of annihilating the race, and of course I find that very disturbing, and I think that to a certain degree, as time goes by, these issues are going to bubble closer to the surface. The more threatened people feel, sometimes the more they let things off their chest. And I'll just answer 1 or 2 more questions. Okay.
On the topic of gender and race, and then also what you had said about community-based efforts working with schools and churches, I run a youth development program for girls and young women of color here in D.C.
Great.
And I work in a public school where it's really amazing to me the level of resistance on the part of the adults within the school not to allow for that kind of a space to take place. I'm Salvadoran, and there's on the immediate, why should I work with Black girls? It's okay for me to work with Latina and Asian, but Black girls are called into question. And I've seen how there are teachers in the school who will literally keep the girls from coming to the program.
Wow.
And it's a really threatening space. Like, we'll start the session by eating lunch together, and we will all sit at a table together, and it's so different from the rest of the lunchroom. The rest of the lunchroom is all the Latino kids, all the Black kids, and the handful of Asian kids. And I'm just wondering, like, what you've seen in terms, because I believe fundamentally, in terms of supporting women's leadership, as we heard, like, move into the next century, that we have to learn how to negotiate these differences of race and language and culture. And so, to try to do that within a public institution is a monumental struggle. And I'm just wondering what you've seen in terms of schools or campuses that you visited and what is happening, because I think a lot of this is a natural flow for this generation.
Right.
They don't see the race in the same way.
But no, you're right. There's a lot of roadblocks from people who are older. And I think that we can't inflict, one of the things I talk about in this book is evaluating your perspective and your cultural heritage and keeping what's good and dumping what's not. We should be evaluating the beliefs that we have. And I think that a lot of groups are, and this is by no means restricted to whites, as you can see, it's like virtually every group has a lot of people within it who say don't mix with them, whoever they are. And you're probably you know, your group is being victimized by that mentality. However, I do think that one thing that happens a lot in public schools, you know, it's somewhat different on college campuses, but what happens a lot in public schools is that teachers basically will not stick their necks out for fear that the parents will get on their backs. And so somehow the dialogue can't just be between the teachers and the students. The parents have to be part of the triangle. And if you can reach the parents and kind of explain what you're doing and build support for it, once the parents are on board, then the teachers will have to be on board. So one thing that I would encourage is kind of bringing parents into the mix. And, you know, this is on a totally different level, but I think about the whole nappy hair controversy. And basically the whole controversy over the book Nappy Hair, which I love, by the way. I would encourage everybody to have, because it's like this creation myth about nappy hair. It was actually written by one of my college professors. But, you know, the book was totally misunderstood because a white parent gave it to black students, and the parents of the students were like, no, what's this white woman giving? No. You know, and it was misguided anger. But, you know, a lot of times people don't know where teachers are coming from until they discuss things. And so I realized how hard it is, because my mother's a teacher in the Baltimore City Public Schools, and she's got 140 kids in the course of a day. And she can, you know, she has to strain to remember all their names, let alone who's living with mom and dad, or just with mom, or with grandma, or with a guardian, and what the names of all those people are. But there still has to be some kind of a dialogue that includes the parents and even maybe community groups, and then you can build on that, and that way also you can encourage, hopefully, dialogue, because I think that this, especially when you talk about like the hip-hop generation speaking broadly and the civil rights generation speaking broadly, even across races, the Latinos, Asians, you speak about the baby boomer and the post-boom generations, dialogue is not good. People are just like, you know, and by bringing the parents into the mix, maybe the kids and the parents will also start to talk, which, you know, would be a blessing. Last question, anybody?
Do you find with your books that people question your objectivity as a journalist?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How do you
Do people question my objectivity? Definitely. Should they question it? Possibly. Should they question everybody else's objectivity? Yes. That's the problem. I don't mind if you question my objectivity. I have definite views, and some of them I express very strongly. But my basic thing, and I talk about this, you know, when I talk about white supremacists and stuff, is like, I'm willing to accord a reporterly level of respect to anybody, even if they don't deserve it. You know, when I went to this church that had threatened to dig up the body of a black child, I was very respectful. Not just out of fear, but because part of my job as a reporter is to walk in and to evaluate, but not to prejudge. So as much as I may be sickened by the idea of the thing, when I walk in the door, my job is to observe. Later on, I will analyze and judge. But when I'm with someone, I try to observe them. I try to get them to talk about themselves. My job is not to put them in a box. My job is to absorb things and then later to evaluate. I think that the problem is very often black journalists and other journalists of color are the ones who are not objective, but everybody else is. It's like, who's objective? I mean, you know, the whole idea of objectivity is you're standing apart from something, looking at it from a distance. Who can stand apart from race? I mean, you know, when you're talking about an issue like this, you're talking about anything. Who stands apart? I mean, if somebody immigrates from Mars and observes race on this planet, then okay, maybe they're objective. But, you know, until then. So I think that, you know, we have to also, it doesn't mean don't trust the media, but also when we talk about objectivity, we have to think more broadly about everybody's relationship to the issue. And certainly here in Washington, you have two very different papers, the Times and the Post, that have very different levels of attitude, objectivity. And I think that that's just one example of how these issues work. But I want to thank you all very much, and I guess I'll sign some books if you want. Thanks.